Okay, I think we're going to make a start, and I'd like to welcome all of you to this event, this webinar, Communicating Low Carbon Lifestyles. My name's Adam Corner, and I'm the Director of Programs and Research at Climate Outreach, and I will be chairing this event today. And it follows on from the publication of the United Nations Environment Programme UNEP Emissions Gap Report at the end of 2020, and our chapter as an author team on equitable low carbon lifestyles within it. And that's the driver of today's event. So you'll hear from each of the three lead authors of the chapter shortly. And I'd like to thank the UNEP steering group as well as the KR Foundation for sponsoring this work and for partnering with us on this project. So we've a nice large group of international participants on the call today, which I think is brilliant, and it reflects the interest in this topic. So thank you all very much for joining us. I'm just going to do a few little bits of housekeeping. I'm sure everyone is getting more and more increasingly familiar with the Zoom functions and etiquette by now. But yeah, we've muted everyone and we've got everyone's video off so that we can concentrate on the speakers. If you could use the Q&A box to ask questions of the speakers, I'll be monitoring that, making sure to a session so that the right question gets addressed to the right speaker. And if you want to kind of chat or comment, post resources, say hello to whichever, use the chat function as people are already, but please keep the questions for the presenters in the Q&A box. If you're on Twitter and you would like to talk about the event, then you can use the hashtag #lowcarbonlifestyles, which is what we're using for this event. So we're ready to get moving, I think, and I really hope you enjoy the session. We'll hear from three of the leaders of the UNEP chapter shortly, but to kick us off first, we have Jamie Clark, who is the Executive Director of Climate Outreach, with some opening remarks.
Hi, and can you hear me, Adam? Yeah, you just can't see me. So thanks, Adam. It was a real and a great pleasure, and we only had a little bit of trepidation when Climate Outreach was asked to take on coordination of this chapter. And this chapter focuses on the role of low carbon lifestyles in closing the emission gaps on behalf of UNEP. And we did work with a brilliant team of international authors who, as Adam said, you'll hear from. But as an organisation, Climate Outreach are really focused on putting people at the heart of addressing climate change. We apply social science to the critical challenges society face. In the reality where we know that 2/3 of global emissions are related to households, there has been, in many respects, very little focus on in-depth understanding of the role that citizens play in addressing climate change until now. So it's hard to underestimate the critical agenda-setting role that this report is having. It's a credit to the UNEP team and the authors that for the first time a UN report of this nature is highlighting three critical yet potentially thorny issues that come with societal transformation. Firstly, we'll hear from Dr. Radhika Khosla of Oxford University about the consumption problem and see how equity is central to future action. Responsibility for tackling climate change is not equally held. Some, the wealthier, in individual countries and at a global level, have far more responsibilities than others to reduce their carbon footprint. Secondly, we'll hear from Dr. Stuart Capstick from the CAR Centre, who will explode the widely held belief that individual action and system change are in opposition, that addressing climate change requires decision makers to choose one route or the other. In reality, lifestyle change is essential alongside system change. Finally, we'll hear from Climate Outreach's own Dr. Susie Wang, who will provide key insights into how we translate these understandings into action, taking the theory into practice, how to go about communicating this crucial message, and what social science research can tell us about how to mainstream low carbon lifestyles. So it really is fantastic to see such an international group of participants attending, and it underlines how important equitable low carbon lifestyles are for closing the global emissions gap. I hope you enjoy this event. At Climate Outreach, we see it as a start of a conversation, a critical step in building the field of understanding and action. And we're keen to play our part, particularly in the run up to COP26. So please do check out the other lifestyle resources we have on our website, support our work, and do get in contact if you'd like to work together. Thank you, and back to you, Adam.
Great, thank you, Jamie. That sets us nicely, and I think it means the stage is set to pass over to the three presenters, the three lead authors of the UNEP chapter. We're going to try and make sure that there's nearly 20 minutes for questions at the end. Do put your questions in the Q&A box as you think of them, and we'll process them and get them to the speakers. And we're going to just show you a short video at the end of the session as well, and some asks, some resources to share. But first up, as Jamie said, it's Dr. Radhika Khosla talking about the nature of the consumption problem. Over.
Thanks very much, Adam, and thank you to everybody who is here as a guest. And we're delighted to be authors of this very interesting chapter. And as Jamie said, chapter 6 of the UNEP Emissions Gap Report for the first time explores the role of lifestyles in bridging the emissions gap. And so the premise of this chapter is that lifestyles are necessary for reducing global emissions at the scale and the speed that is necessary to meet the commitments under the Paris Accord. And I just want to pause and reflect on that for a moment, because what is really critical here is the shift of moving away from solutions that are only technologically oriented and solutions that are not in the hands of individuals and sort of have humans at their core and societies at their core. And I think that shift that this chapter makes is fundamental in having us meet our emissions target and the 1.5 degree goal. And what we're going to talk with you about is the different ways in which this can happen. Now, the reason why this is important to begin with is that around 2/3 of the emissions has been linked to lifestyles when we use emissions-based accounting. And the main sectors that we're going to look at in this report are from food, transport, and residential energy use. And each of these account for about 20% of lifestyle emissions. Can I have the next slide, please? Yeah, so I've sort of spoken to those already. I think we can move to the next slide. Thank you. Now, the way in which we organize how we can use our consumption patterns and use them in a way to actually reduce emissions is by having a framework that is called avoid, shift, and improve. And this is useful because it allows us to think through the different types of actions we can take in different sectors. Now, this is an emerging framework in the literature, and we've applied it and adapted it to a meta review of studies that was done by one of our chapter co-authors, Diana Ivanova. Now, in the first case, and you can see from the figure here, when we look at mobility, for instance, the first way of organizing our emissions reduction is to think about them in terms of what it would mean to avoid certain activities. So in mobility, one way to avoid certain activities is to fly less. And it's very interesting, but for example, if you avoided one long-haul return flight, the potential of that avoided emissions is a reduction of just under 2 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year, which is a large amount. Now, apart from avoiding certain types of activities, another way to change how we consume is to shift certain types of activities. So for instance, this could include a shift towards, say, a more vegetarian-based diet or a more plant-based diet. So we shift from eating a lot more meat to instead eating much more vegetarian food. And that has the potential to reduce emissions by about 0.5 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. So again, a good amount. And then finally, the third way of organizing our consumption activities in terms of how we could reduce emissions is to think about improving our activities so that we actually improve the way we consume, and as a result, we end up using less. So one way in which we can do that is to think that we have energy efficiency in homes. And when you use energy efficiency, what you're doing is actually you're getting the same amount of output, But in the end, you're using less energy to get to that output. And another way to think about improving emissions is to use renewables in homes. And that also has the potential. So using renewables, for instance, has the potential of reducing emissions by 1.5 tons per year. Now, we can see from all these examples that actually mobility has the largest potential to reduce emissions, particularly in an equitable way. And there's a strong link between income and mobility, particularly because we're talking about long-haul flights, which are often taken, considered to be a less essential consumption item or a luxury item. And by contrast, if we think about food, that's much more of a basic consumption sort of realm, and it can be much harder to do that because obviously we can't avoid food for obvious reasons. May I have the next slide, please? Now, one of the key messages from this chapter is also that when we think about consumption, we have to ask the question, who is consuming? And where does it matter, in terms of where this consumption takes place, and by whom does this consumption take place? Who should reduce it, and who potentially can't reduce? And as this chapter shows, there's actually a very strong link between inequality in emissions based on income. So while most of our emissions globally can be linked to household activities, so things that we do every day in the house, it doesn't mean that all individuals have the same footprint or all individuals are consuming in the same way. And that's an important point for us to reflect upon. And this figure, as you see over here, is one of the key figures in our chapter, and it was developed by an analysis that was done led by Oxfam and one of our chapter authors, Tim Gore. Now, these numbers are, they're in line with other estimates, and they're quite startling because, as they tell us, the richest 1%, which is about 80 million people, together consume twice as much as the poorest 50%. And that number is about, just a little less than 4 billion. So we have about 1% of the population consuming more than twice of the poorest 50%. Now, obviously, these top 1% do not all live in the same place. They don't live in the same country, and they're scattered across continents. So inequity is not just between countries, it's also within countries, and recognizing that is key to understanding what low carbon equitable lifestyles would look like. And now half of this consumption and half of the emissions that come from this consumption, especially in the top 1% and 10%, do come from high income countries, and half from about middle income countries, just to give you a sense of geographically where our emissions are currently based and coming from. Now, one implication of that on a per capita basis is that the globally richest folks, so that's the 1% of the richest people globally, need to reduce their footprint by a factor of 30. So that's 30, in order to meet the targets for 1.5 degrees. At the same time, the poorest 50%, so the world's poorest 50% population, can increase their emissions by a factor of 3 and still remain under the target for average per capita consumption emissions. And often this is, this is societies and groups of individuals who currently are so far away from, from sort of the standard international basic quality of life and development, that the way these numbers are organized is they actually tell us that if the top 1% are to reach more equitable consumption patterns, then they would need to reduce by 30, and the poorest 50% could increase by 3 and still be well below the average per capita emission consumptions. So what I'm going to do is stop there and now turn it over to Stuart to talk about some of the mechanisms by which we can achieve these lifestyle changes.
Thanks, Radhika. Hello, everyone. I'm Stuart Capstick. I work within the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations, or the CAST Centre. I'm one of the authors of the chapter, along with Radhika, Susie, Adam, and quite a few other people as well. If I could have the next slide, please. So we heard from Radhika just now about some of the areas where lifestyle change needs to happen, particularly in terms of food, mobility, and home energy use, and what that might look like in terms of relative contributions of avoiding, shifting, or improving. But we do recognise in the chapter that it's one thing to say that the way we live needs to change, but we also need to say how that would actually happen. And in the past, I think there's been an unfortunate assumption that when we talk about lifestyle or behaviour change, what this really equates to is voluntary individual action, that lifestyle change is entirely a matter of personal choice. But as far as we're concerned, as also of this chapter, and we were kind of at pains to emphasise this throughout the process of putting the chapter together, when we talk about lifestyle change, this is something that we see as being driven by a much wider range of forces at every scale, from the personal and the immediate, through social and cultural contexts, and in terms of changes to infrastructure and national level policies. And this is illustrated in this figure shown here, which is also in the chapter. So a core point that we make is that to bring about lifestyle change, we need both individual action and measures taken at a more systemic level. And not only do we need both, but they're not really separate things. They're interrelated. They're two sides of the same coin. And there are some nice examples in the literature of how these things are related. So, for example, various studies have shown how household solar panels can spread across neighbourhoods. So when one household puts up panels on their roof, this can lead to others doing so, and a domino effect happening in particular locations. And I think this illustrates well the link between personal action and wider change, which is sort of too often overlooked. A little more anecdotally, on my own occasional trip to the supermarket this last weekend, I couldn't help but notice that the massive increase in vegetarian and vegan products available in the supermarket. So Radhika mentioned, dietary change is an essential component of lifestyle change, and people were buying these products in Tesco's, and this is quite a recent phenomenon in the UK, but a good example of change happening at several levels and the interactions between those levels. It's partly about individual action. To some extent, we all choose what we buy and what we eat, but it's also been a process whereby people making their own changes have sort of subtle influences on friends and family as they make those changes. There's been a major role for organised campaigns like Veganuary to try out vegan diets in January. And the large retailers are also getting in on the act by developing bigger ranges of foods and giving more sort of shelf space and so on. Next slide, please. So we go into some more detail in the chapter in relation to some of the different routes to enable lifestyle change, and this includes things like, although not an exclusive list, but things like the use of incentives, information, and changes to choices available to people. It includes changes to infrastructure and the built environment, and to social conventions and norms. There's an important role for peer and social influence. There are times when specific interventions can be used to disrupt routine behaviours and habits. And last but not least, there's an important role for active citizen participation, including through political action or protest. And in the chapter, we draw particular attention to approaches along these sorts of lines, which have actually been implemented in real life around the world, and so have taken place in practice. Next slide, please. So when we highlight change that can happen and has happened, we've done this in relation to lifestyle change by the different sectors. So in the case of mobility, one example of the use of basic information change, the use of information to change behaviour is the growing use of health warnings and eco labels for fuel purchases. This is a fairly new idea in practice, but it's recently been legally mandated in Sweden, as well as in the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts in the USA, where there are now health warnings which must be provided on petrol pumps. But beyond the use of just information, there are a wider range of examples showing that the sorts of combination of measures I spoke about a minute ago are critical for enabling more active travel, so walking and cycling, for example, around the world. The growth in cycling in Bogota in Colombia, for example, has been made possible by investment over many years in cycle-friendly infrastructure, through the reallocation of street space, and through policies such as regular car-free days. But what's also clear from the literature on parts of the world that have been able to move towards more active travel is that advocacy groups have been a critical part of sort of maintaining the political will and motivation to prioritise cycling and to raise its profile through campaigns and other activities. And so I think that shows that while we might see our sort of ultimate objective as being lifestyle or behaviour change in the domain of mobility, so for higher levels of walking or cycling, this has come about through actions taken across many different scales and domains. There are other examples as well. So for more recently in China, there's evidence that restrictions on petrol cars combined with incentives for electric vehicles have led to an increase in people buying and driving electric vehicles. And again, in terms of those wider social effects, there's research in Norway that shows that peer-to-peer communication about electric vehicles, so people talking to each other about them, has led to a growth in their purchase and use. And the point here, I think, is that if you buy an electric vehicle, you're not just reducing your emissions from your own travel, but you become a part of changing what's seen as typical or normal. One very direct way to reduce emissions from aviation, of course, is to not expand or build more airport capacity, so not to provide conditions for more high carbon mobility in the first place. So in Bristol, in the UK, where I live, strong local opposition and activism in fact led to rejection of the planning application for airport expansion last year. And if we think back to what Radhika was saying about reducing emissions from mobility being an area which is where equity is very important, where the sort of wealthiest people have the highest footprint in very large part due to aviation and surface travel, then we can see that this is an area that I think is very appropriate to focus on. Next slide, please. So in terms of food and diet, the EU's Farm to Fork initiative, we highlight this in the UNEP chapter, because this is a cross-national initiative which explicitly recognises the need to move towards a more plant-based diet with less red and processed meat. And this set of policies has an emphasis on action by food companies for health and sustainability, as well as talking about the options to use tax incentives to promote consumption of fruit and vegetables and to place costs on more polluting foods. And while the language in this strategy, the EU strategy here is quite cautious, I mean, this is potentially quite a politically thorny area, it does, I think, reflect a growing recognition in policy circles that changing diets will be necessary for reducing emissions. At the city level as well, there are a range of projects which have been set up so that people are more able to grow their own food in urban settings. So one example is Quezon in the Philippines, where tax exemptions and agricultural zones have been used to do this, in part recently as a response to disruption from COVID to enable food security as well. And in the chapter, we also highlight that when the state sector has control over provision and procurement of food, there's opportunities to take more direct action to ensure that that is low carbon and sustainable. And one example is the city of Leeds in the UK, which, as a response to its declaration of a climate emergency, the council made a commitment to increase their provision of meat-free meals in schools. And likewise, the EU's Farm to Fork initiative talks about the EU administrative bodies also taking similar approaches. And there are other examples as well where meat and dairy consumption has been shown to be reduced through the combined effects of community-based action, health campaigns, and the intervention of health professionals, including the very long-standing North Karelia project in Finland, which has done this. More generally with food, I think there are some very close links between healthier diets and low carbon diets, and so every reason to emphasize both of these rationales in approaches designed to change how we eat. The next slide, please. So this is my last slide, but focusing finally on the context of residential energy use, there are again a range of policy measures which have been used to change lifestyles and reduce emissions from households. One really interesting approach, which I think would firmly fit into the kind of nudge school of influencing behaviour, is the use of default renewable energy tariffs for domestic electricity. This hasn't been tried that much, but it has been done in parts of Germany and the USA, and has been shown to greatly increase uptake of green tariffs. So people are much more likely to stick with a default green tariff than to choose to move over to one where they have a non-renewable tariff. In India as well, there's been a rapid increase in the domestic uptake of low energy LED lighting in the home. And demand for these, for LED lighting, has multiplied over 100 times in the space of 5 years. So people are buying LEDs and putting them in their homes. And one of the reasons for this is because of subsidies that have led to very low prices of LEDs for households, and other policies, including climate policy, has supported this. And I should say this is a topic that Radhika herself has specifically carried out research on, and so she would know a great deal more about that than I would, but I just touch on it here as an example of how rapid change has occurred. In other parts of the world too, there have been policy requirements for energy efficient product standards and energy and carbon labelling of products, which has led to consumer purchasing decisions. And also, finally, following the financial crisis of just over 10 years ago, we know that some governments used public investment to retrofit housing and to make home renovations more affordable and attractive to households. And I think as we are hopefully moving beyond the COVID crisis, there's an important place for exactly this sort of government support to again be used as part of recovery measures. And this is discussed in more detail across the UN emissions gap report as a whole, as well as touched on in our chapter. So I hope that's given some illustration of the sort of variety of ways in which we think lifestyle change can be achieved and has been done in practice. I'm going to hand over to Susie now, who's going to say some more about COVID and communicating lifestyle change.
Thanks, Stuart. Yes, next slide, please. All right. Hi, everyone. So we are now entering, unfortunately, our second year with COVID-19. And as we were writing this chapter, governments were just, and people were just starting to respond to the pandemic. And one of the things that we know by now is that while the pandemic has led to a sizable drop in global emissions, it's unlikely to make a difference in the long run unless it's sustained. And we also know that from previous economic downturns, generally when there is such a dip, it tends to lead to a higher bounce back in emissions afterwards. So there is an opportunity and also lessons to be learned here about how to ensure a green recovery from COVID-19, and also how, more generally, how to bring about low carbon transitions that we need. And I guess the key lesson is less about the drop in emissions and more about how major rapid lifestyle changes can be brought about through the cooperation and coordination of governments and individuals. So the first thing is that the governments need to lead the way to create the enabling conditions for lifestyle change in an equitable manner. So measures include regulations and incentives that Stuart mentioned. Things like retrofitting housing and of public housing has played a role in previous recoveries as well. Second, individuals can together build positive social norms and also a collective sense that we can do something about a collective issue to promote the adoption of low carbon behaviors. And finally, the development of infrastructure in these moments of disruption can lock in any behavioral changes that occur. So for instance, some cities around the world are taking the opportunity to disrupt patterns of travel by redesigning urban areas' roads to accommodate cyclists and other sort of forms of active travel. So for climate communicators, the coming months or the next year will be crucial because it's a moment of change for low carbon lifestyle change. Governments are working through recovery plans, and as new habits are being formed all around the world, it's more important than ever to communicate low carbon lifestyle change in an effective way to make sure that we can help bring about the policy and behavioral changes that are needed to reduce global emissions. Next slide, please. Part of this is ensuring that it's clear what behaviors make the biggest difference. So what matters and also what doesn't matter, where campaigns in the past might have focused on sort of relatively simple and painless behaviors that don't necessarily have a great impact on emissions. And as Radhika already showed, the most impactful gains can be made in certain areas and certain actions. So for instance, reducing long-haul return flights, particularly among the richest, as well as shifting diets towards more vegetarian options. And as Stuart mentioned, both not only in terms of individual choices, but also at a systemic level, for instance, in public canteens. And finally, also improving the efficiency of vehicles and renewable energy in homes are another example. Next slide, please. So this knowledge is necessary, but as many social scientists and climate communicators might be aware, knowledge is not sufficient in changing people's behaviors. Decades of social science research and behavioral research has shown that it's important to connect actions and policies to people's underlying motivations, to their values, to their sense of who they are, their identities. Measures also need to be seen as desirable and normal, and positive norms around low carbon actions can be communicated or should be communicated in a non-polarizing way. Another factor that has been talked about already is that the power of peer-to-peer engagement. Talking about climate change with peers can build confidence and a sense of efficacy about climate change actions, and being able to make a difference, which can be quite a powerful thing. Through social influence, people can dispel misconceptions, they can share ideas and practices. As Stuart alluded to, it can be linked to the adoption of electric vehicles, solar panels, other kinds of things. And people might also realize that more people care than they previously thought. And finally, there's a positive, empowering message about highlighting the multiple benefits, not only to the climate, but also to health and well-being, that low carbon lifestyles can and also should be compatible with well-being and a good standard of living for everyone, that they're also equitable lifestyles and also healthy lifestyles. And in this sense, effective communication can make things clearer, just to sum up quickly, by focusing on the most impactful changes, by making sure that the ask is fair, so that individual actions are also balanced by structural changes that enable them, and in line with people's values, ideas of what's normal and beneficial in many ways. Next slide, thanks. But there are still some ongoing challenges in the communication of lifestyle change. It's tended to be a controversial topic in the past, and just before we get into the Q&A, I'm going to leave you with some questions just to start us off. First is, how do we communicate about wealth and carbon inequality in an effective way? How do we navigate the controversial aspects of lifestyle change? Things that are usually considered personal choices and choices of personal freedom, and how do we do so in a way that doesn't divide or put people off? How do we balance the communication of the need for both individual lifestyle change and system change and decarbonization? And finally, what are the key barriers to communicating lifestyle change? That's all I had. I'm going to pass back to Adam, who will chair the Q&A session. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Susie, Radhika, and Stuart. There's some, I mean, I would say this, but I think there's some really compelling messages in here that together I think add up to a really strong argument that we need to get past the idea that lifestyle change and system change are somehow in opposition. I think the case that's being made here is that they're clearly two sides of the same coin. And I want to, there's some brilliant questions coming through. There's a lively chat, which is brilliant, and there's some excellent questions in the Q&A function. So I will try to get to as many of these as we can before through the Q&A. The first one that I want to pick up on, I mean, there's some responses happening in the Q&A. I'm going to come back to you, Radhika, if that's okay first. Just to paint a bit of a picture for everyone. We talk that those equity discrepancies in figures are so stark, they're incredible. But there's been some commentary suggesting, you know, no one thinks they're in that top 10%, let alone the top 1%. So who are these people? Are they, you know, can you paint a picture of who's in the top 10% at least?
Thanks, Adam. It's, you know, I think it's a good question, and it's a question that I can speak to in terms of trends as opposed to pointing fingers, and you know, it's probably the better way to answer it anyway. But you know, the point being that, like I was saying, air travel is quite a key marker of those who are amongst the higher end of the spectrum in terms of consuming more, right? So if we look across our three different sectors, which were mobility, food, and residences, and if we look at the most emitting activities in each of those, so for instance, air travel under mobility, intense meat-based diets under food, and then, you know, homes that have large amounts of energy consumption because of space, because of heating and cooling requirements, it begins to give you a sort of picture of the type of you know, household or individual that is consuming a lot more than many other parts of their own society and societies in other parts of the world. So it's sort of you know, like I said, I'm not pointing fingers on who those individuals are, but I would instead try to answer that question in a broader way in terms of pointing to the characteristics that make up the sort of richest 1% or the richest 10%.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Radhika. And I guess it's just helps to make clear it's not just the kind of gold-plated yachts brigade. You know, there is a proportion of people with really high consuming lifestyles that, you know, there's some scope for change there. There was an excellent question, I thought, an excellent challenge, which I'm going to put to you, if that's okay. And anyone that's seen Stuart's Twitter handle will know that he's got strong opinions on the links between lifestyle change and system change. But isn't a focus on change somehow a bit unethical when we know, okay, people are involved in, you know, consuming energy, but where does it come from? You know, it comes from corporate kind of controlled energy sources. So shouldn't that be the focus? Isn't it a bit missing the point to focus on lifestyle change at all?
Well, as you yourself, can you hear me? I wasn't sure if the video is working. Yeah. As you yourself often mention, Adam, the climate change isn't everything, and the kitchen sink problem. And I do think that there can be a risk, and this is partly why people react against talk of lifestyle change or behaviour change. There can be a risk that this is used to displace responsibility or detract responsibility away from those corporations and energy suppliers. And I think there's two responses to that. One, it's not one or the other. And two, I would love to see organizations like Exxon take more responsibility, but how is that going to happen? How are we going to have system change? Often I think systemic change, changes to the law, requirements for large energy companies to not be so destructive, shall we say, are almost spoken of in the abstract, like that will sort of happen somehow. The only way that we will get to that sort of systemic change, the only way that companies like that will be held to account is through the actions and the activities of people. You know, today in the United States, Joe Biden is inaugurated, Trump's off. there was only a few thousand votes between Trump and Biden. And okay, that's an extreme example, but I think we should be careful not to be lulled into a sense that we're somehow sort of passive and it has to happen at that higher level. It doesn't mean that everything is down to us, but it does mean that we should feel more empowered and that we have a part to play in making those bigger system changes. Rant over.
Great, thank you, Stuart. Sorry, just missed the very last half a second of what you said then, but we got most of it. Susie, I wonder if I could put a question to you. We've had a few questions around, I guess, broadly around sort of narratives and communication, and you talked a bit about co-benefits, the other benefits of these low carbon lifestyle choices that people can make. I wondered if you could say a bit more about that, whether it's sort of health or job creation. I guess health in the context of the career. Is that something that's even more salient now, or is that confusing things too much?
Thanks, Adam. Sorry, you cut out at the end there, but I think I got most of it. Yeah, there have been some really good questions, particularly about health and co-benefits. And I did, as I was saying in my presentation, highlighting the multiple benefits of climate action. That there's a lot of sense in that, but it also it's quite tends to be a more broadly appealing message. So in other work that we've done, messages about air pollution, for instance, are quite well received across the political spectrum. And as Stuart was saying, a low carbon diet is often a healthy diet as well. And if you think about transport options, active transport is also likely to lead to better health outcomes as well. So I think that there's a lot of potential there in communicating the multiple benefits.
Thanks, Susie. I mean, there's been I'm looking across some different questions here, and I guess they're sort of broadly around whether lifestyle change or changes broadly, including system change on the scale that's needed, but especially lifestyle changes, are they feasible? I mean, what does that look like to reduce your carbon footprint by 30 times? Is that something that people will be at all able to even engage with? So I wanted to come to you, Radhika, with that question, if that's okay. Is it politically feasible? Is there an appetite for this level of change, and is it a vote winner essentially? I guess maybe we could start with you, Radhika, but perhaps Stuart, you could come in on that as well.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. The answer to that question is it is possible. What our chapter is doing is telling us the ways in which that possibility can play out. Like we show, it's not it's not straightforward every time, but the mechanisms that lead to that interchange and that push between what is individually based and systemically based is what is going to make it possible, right? And that is where political feasibility will also come from. So like Stuart mentioned, the role of individuals as citizens is key to that, because that's one of the mechanisms by which we allow and enable that political feasibility to play out. So so while it's not necessarily something that that would happen overnight, there are a number of different examples in a number of different countries that are at a number of different stages of development that demonstrate to us that between the economic, the legal, the social, the ideas around our attitudes and awareness, in each of these different realms, there are many ways in which countries and individuals are already making these shifts. What we need to do is scale them up. But the sort of core point of your question about whether this is possible, the answer is absolutely, it is possible, and it is already happening. Often in more ways than we even know. That's not to take away from all the work that is yet to happen in enhancing and scaling lifestyle change, but it is possible.
That's a really strong answer. I think that it is totally feasible to achieve this scale of change. Stuart, did you want to come in on the question of, is it politically, is there much political appetite for it? Do politicians want this? You know, is it a vote winner? Will people vote?
Oh yeah, I mean, this is this is clearly a tricky one, and I think it's something that policymakers and politicians are understandably hesitant about. I think it wouldn't have been so long ago that talk of policy to change how much meat people ate or reduce flying, for example, would have been seen as just completely toxic and completely off the table. That is changing, I think, slowly, not least because of the Committee on Climate Change is now coming out and saying that we have to sort of, so the Committee on Climate Change being the advisory body in the UK is now coming out and saying that we need to deal with these things. I mean, so some of this is hard, and I don't think we can pretend that there's just perfect benefits for everyone at all times from making these changes. But it is important to remember that a lot of these changes are actually aligned with our health and our well-being and you know, better societies and so on. So more active travel, better, healthier diets. I mean, there isn't a perfect correspondence between a low carbon diet and a healthy diet, but there's a pretty good one. And if policymakers and politicians are willing to adopt and make policy on healthy eating, then it doesn't seem too big a leap to me that they would do that for low carbon foods, particularly seeing as that's a sort of double reason to do so. I mean, at the local level, I mean, politics isn't just national. There a lot people often refer these days to the role of cities as being that kind of supranational scale, and a lot is happening at cities where changes can be made. And you know, I mentioned the city where I live, Bristol, where there was a concerted local campaign to oppose local airport expansion. You know, that's just one example, but change, important sort of change like that can happen at local political scale as well as nationally.
Thanks, Stuart. I mean, I guess on the maybe picking up on the sort of healthier eating and eating differently question, there was a question earlier which was I guess around would vegan, does the fact that there are more vegan choices available and the fact that people are consuming more vegan food, and you see it in the supermarkets increasingly, does that necessarily mean, I was going to come to you, Susie, with this question, that you know that people are actually eating in a lower carbon way, you know, are consuming less meat? And I guess the, you know, the implication there is are mess about kind of, you know, consuming differently, you know, enough, or is it also, you know, a need to really have that kind of consume less?
Thanks, Adam, and also thanks for the question. Yeah, so in the chapter we talk about a study that that looked at the impact on emissions if average diets are reduced to full or partial vegetarianism. And I think emissions can potentially be reduced by up to 31% in that case, or something like that. And then there was another study, I can try and link it in the chat, that modeled the best outcomes for emissions based on different dietary choices, trying to balance not only emissions, but also land use concerns and other environmental impacts. And the best case for emissions is also one that not only reduces meat consumption, but also reduces overconsumption and food waste. So I think that's another element of it that's really important. And in general, I think food waste is something that's less controversial than reducing meat consumption. Yeah, I think that was all I had.
Thanks, Susie. There was a chat, and thank you for the questions. It's great to have such high engagement with this. I guess around how you can sort of encourage related behavior changes. So it's not just individual, isolated behavior changes and lifestyle changes, even if they are significant, but how can you kind of encourage a more holistic sort of engagement with this overall challenge? I mean, that to me speaks to the idea of spillover. You know, how do you sort of, if you change one behavior, does it lead to changes in other behaviors? And I know that's something, Stuart, that you've done quite a bit of work on. would you be able to say a little bit about that? What the evidence is around spillover, and how do you get that kind of program?
Oh, yeah, I could try. I mean, so behavioural spillover is something that is and has been detected, can be detected, but it's certainly not automatic, and there are sort of a lot of contingencies in that. You know, if someone undertakes one behaviour, like, I don't know, reducing less meat for one reason, it doesn't necessarily mean they will then go on to do another environmentally friendly behaviour, unless they have sort of similar motivations and link those behaviours together. And there are sometimes cases as well where negative spillover can occur. So that, you know, for example, you do something, you feel you've done your bit, and then you go and do something harmful. So there's when I come off the video, I'll see if I can find the link. There's a nice meta-analysis of spillover that I'll try and track down and put in the Zoom chat. I think in terms of sort of behavior changes being more collective, less individual, I do wonder the extent to which this is how we think about it and how we've come to think about it, and that there's an important role for communication there, you know, and for organisations like Climate Outreach. I think as I said at the start of my bit, I think it's unfortunate that we have, one way or another, tended to typically think of behaviour change as being isolated and individual, and maybe that's part of the kind of you know, consumerist way of looking at things. Maybe that's just, you know, how it's ended up that way. But I think we need sort of new ways of talking, new sort of language to think about these things. When we wrote the chapter, I was, you know, constantly sort of struggling. Do I use the word lifestyle, behaviour, action, practices? I don't think we have well, maybe someone will make a suggestion, but I don't think we have a readily accessible language that conveys the fact that these sorts of changes we're making are me as a person and us as my family, community, organisation, etc. And I would like to see us sort of grapple with that better.
Did you want to add anything to that, Radhika, as well?
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, no, I think Stuart answered that really comprehensively. The one thing that I would add is that, you know, often linked behaviors are rooted in linked motivations, like Stuart said, and those motivations can many times not be related to climate change. So, for instance, there are multiple objectives that, as Susie had mentioned, that societies and individuals have, and those can be linked to certain quality of life, to jobs, to clean air, clean water, to less crime, and often the way through to getting individuals to act is through those priorities that make sense for them, but at the same time go hand in hand with addressing climate change. And so that idea of multiple objectives originally sort of, you know, used as called co-benefits has been so central to how we think about climate change, particularly in places and in contexts where climate change is, you know, it isn't the leading priority for often very good reasons for individuals and communities. And I think that same tool is very useful in enabling those types of linked behaviors that Stuart talked about.
That's a really, I mean, I think that's a really nice way to kind of start to wrap all this up, really. That it's not just about linked behaviors, it's about something a bit deeper than that, linked motivations, the kind of values that, you know, that underpin how we think and act about a whole range of different topics. And that sort of glue that. So there's been some commentary in the Q&A box around, I guess, challenging what kind of things are, you know, are lifestyle changes. You know, is acting as a citizen, as a voter, a lifestyle change? And I think that speaks to some of Stuart's points at the end there about really lacking a sort of a language to have, I guess, a more mature conversation about this really, really critical issue. We can see the statistics, I think, are really striking. 2/3 of all of all emissions can be linked to lifestyles and people. Maybe that's not surprising when we step back and think about it, but I think it is something that's been overlooked. And I just want to wrap up with a few kind of concluding points now on the next slide, please, before we show you a video to end things with, which is us kind of capturing some of the key messages that we're talking about in this chapter. Because I think really what we've all been able to do here is to try and change the conversation on low carbon lifestyles. You know, at the Cast Centre, in Rad's work at Oxford University, at Climate Outreach, and for the rest of our co-authors and the KR Foundation as well. It's something that I think we're really keen to do, to work sophisticated language, a more mature approach to understanding that lifestyle change, system change are two sides of the same coin. As Stuart says, quoting myself back at him, it's a kind of everything in kitchen sink problem climate change. So what have we got coming next? We've got a set of what we're calling learn and strategize sessions, which are going to be for sort of smaller groups of people working on low carbon lifestyles and how to communicate, and thinking about this from a policy angle, from campaigns angle, and from people who fund this kind of work as well and research on it too. We've got some events and hopefully even a tentative low carbon lifestyles festival run up to COP26, which we're excited about. And we've got a few requests of you all as well. If you could share the video that we're about to show afterwards and some graphics that we've produced, then they're really nice ways of communicating some of the concise messages that come out of this work, I think. Please do download the chapter itself from Climate Outreach website and a linked briefing paper, which is on the CAST website. If you haven't had a chance to look at them yet, they're nice summaries of this work. And I guess really what we're saying is, talk to people, change the discourse, change the conversation through the work that you do about the key messages that we're kind of trying to get across here. And I think there's better than I can summarize it to sort of end things with a video that we've created part of this work. So if we could skip to the next slide, please, and I'll let that play. And I think it's a nice way of wrapping up what we've been talking about here, and a nice way of sharing some of these key messages in a more accessible way. Next slide, please.
Climate change is everyone's problem, but who should do something about it? Individuals changing their lifestyles, or governments leading the way? It's not one or the other. We need both. Lifestyle change and system change are two sides of the same coin. While everyone can do something about climate change, some people can do a lot more. The world's richest 1% have carbon footprints over 100 times that of someone in the poorest 50%. Wealthier individuals can have the largest effect on driving down emissions by reducing air travel, choosing low-carbon diets, reducing food waste, and shifting patterns of energy use at home. Governments can also enable change through effective policymaking, developing better rail infrastructure, providing cycle-to-work schemes, supporting the take-up of electric vehicles, and eco-funding for housing. System change makes lifestyle change possible. Lifestyle change is also about volunteering, donating, investing, marching, voting, and talking about climate change with those around us. Together, we have power as citizens and consumers, and as friends and family members, to create system change. Being serious about limiting warming to 1.5 degrees means throwing everything, including the kitchen sink, at it. Nothing works without fossil fuels staying in the ground, but changing how we live is also crucial. Help us change the way people think about lifestyle change. Share this video and find out more here.
Okay, so that brings us to an end. I know we've all got an inauguration to watch potentially, but if you do have just a couple of minutes to complete a really short feedback that will come at you as the Zoom call ends, we'd really appreciate that. It's always super useful to get feedback, on the webinar, on the event, the chapter, but also some of these key messages, because we really want to try and change the discourse on low carbon lifestyles. So with that, we will thank you all for your time and your input and your questions today. And that's all from us. Thank you very much.